Imagine a giant aircraft carrier the size of 10 football fields floating in the middle of the Atlantic. Now imagine that this monster, 600 meters long, is not made of steel, but of ice. Yes, you heard that right, ice. And it wasn't some crazy idea from just anyone. It was an official project of the British Navy during World War II. But wait, it gets better because the Germans, who thought they were the masters of naval engineering, mocked this idea until the moment they saw that the British were dead serious. Very serious. This is the story of Project Habakkuk, one of the most insane and at the same time brilliant plans that ever emerged in times of war. Can you imagine the faces of German engineers when they found out about this? But hold on, because this story has twists you won't believe. The question is, would an ice ship really work? Stay with me until the end, because you'll discover why this project almost changed the course of the war, and why it never got off the ground, even though it was approved by Winston Churchill himself. Let's start from the beginning, and I guarantee you that every minute of this story will leave you more impressed. We're in 1942, and England's situation was critical. German submarines, the famous U-boats, were destroying everything in the Atlantic. Imagine the scene. Entire British convoys loaded with food, weapons, and supplies, coming from America being sunk one after another. England was literally starving to death. The Germans had a huge advantage. They operated in an area of the Atlantic that British planes couldn't reach. It was like a black hole in the middle of the ocean, where U-boats had a field day. And the British? Well, they urgently needed a solution. Have you ever stopped to think how desperate it must be when you're losing a war at sea and have no way to protect your ships? Well, that's exactly what was happening. Every day that passed, more ships were sinking, more soldiers were dying, more food was lost at the bottom of the sea. It was an impossible situation. Do you think you could sleep at night knowing your country is being strangled like this? And it was in this moment of total desperation that a guy named Geoffrey Pike appeared. Now pay attention, because this guy wasn't your average military man. Geoffrey Pike was considered an eccentric genius, one of those people that others look at and think the guy is crazy, but at the same time, respect, because he had ideas nobody else would have. He worked for Combined Operations Headquarters, which was like the British Special Operations Sector, commanded by none other than Lord Louis Mountbatten. And Pike was in the United States working on another project when he had an idea that would change everything. He was thinking about the U-boat problem, that black hole in the middle of the Atlantic, and thought, how can we put an aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean if there's not enough steel? Because that was the problem. Steel was scarce. All available steel was being used to make tanks, planes, warships. You couldn't just build more aircraft carriers. So Pike had an absurd idea. What if we use ice? Think about it. Ice is abundant, it's cheap, you can make as much as you want, it costs practically nothing in energy compared to making steel, and it's available anywhere. You must be thinking, okay, but ice melts, ice breaks, how are you going to make a ship out of ice? And that's where it gets interesting. Pike wasn't thinking of ordinary ice. He knew pure ice wouldn't work, but what if we mix the ice with something? And that's when British scientists got into action. They started doing secret experiments and discovered something incredible. If you mix water with sawdust, about 14% sawdust and 86% water, and freeze it, you create a material that's much stronger than ordinary ice. Much stronger. This material was called pykrete, in honor of Geoffrey Pike himself. Tell me something. Have you ever imagined that mixing sawdust with water could create a material stronger than concrete? Well, the scientists were amazed too. Pykrete wasn't just strong, it had other incredible properties. It melted much slower than normal ice, and when you shot at it, bullets would ricochet. Imagine, a bulletproof material that you can mass produce using basically water and sawdust. It seemed too good to be true. But there was a problem, and this problem was serious. Ice, even mixed with sawdust, has a property called plastic flow. That means ice moves slowly, as if it's melting from the inside, and eventually starts to deform. So a ship made of pykrete would literally start to crumble over time, unless you kept it super cold, like minus 16 degrees Celsius. And how do you do that? Well, you need a giant refrigeration system with tubes throughout the entire ship pumping frozen brine to keep everything frozen. Got complicated, right? But the British didn't give up. They decided to run experiments. Scientist Max Perritz was put in charge of testing pykrete, and guess where he did these tests? In a cold storage facility under Smithfield Meat Market in London. Like, these guys were testing a secret military project in the middle of frozen animal carcasses. Can you imagine the scene? White-coated scientists in the middle of frozen meat testing blocks of ice mixed with sawdust. Sounds like a movie scene, but it was real, and the results were promising. Pykrete really was strong. When you hit it with a hammer, it didn't break. When you shot at it, the bullet didn't penetrate. But the big question was, can you make a ship out of this? And it's not just any ship. We're talking about a giant aircraft carrier. So Lord Mountbatten, who was Pike's boss and a big supporter of the project, decided it was time to show this to the important people. And when I say important people, I'm talking about Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister. Now imagine the scene. Mountbatten goes to Churchill with this crazy idea of an ice ship. How do you convince your country's leader that this isn't madness? Well, Mountbatten had a brilliant idea. He grabbed a block of pykrete and went to show Churchill. And you know where he showed it? In the bathroom. That's right. Churchill was taking a bath when Mountbatten came in with the block of pykrete. He said, "Prime Minister, I want to put this in your bathtub." Churchill must have found that very strange, but he let him. Mountbatten put the block in the hot bathwater, and guess what happened? The block didn't melt. Well, it started melting on the outside, but the sawdust created a protective layer that insulated the interior, and the block stayed firm. Churchill was impressed. Very impressed. So much so that he authorized the project immediately. Do you think you'd have the courage to present an idea like that to your boss while he's in the bath? But the story doesn't stop there. Churchill was so excited that he wanted to show this to the Americans, because the plan was to get the Americans into the project and help build this ice monster. So in 1943, during the Quebec Conference, where Allied leaders met to discuss the war, Mountbatten prepared a live demonstration. He brought 2 blocks, one of ordinary ice and one of pykrete. The room was full of admirals, generals, and even Franklin Roosevelt himself, the President of the United States. Mountbatten took a pistol and shot at the ordinary ice block. Boom, the ice exploded into 1,000 pieces. Everyone moved away from the shards. Then Mountbatten aimed at the pykrete block and shot again. And you know what happened? The bullet ricocheted. And it wasn't just any ricochet. The bullet flew across the room and nearly hit Admiral Ernest King, who was the commander of the U.S. Navy. The bullet grazed his leg. Imagine the shock. A room full of the most powerful guys in the Western world and a stray bullet passing through them. Some accounts say the bullet grazed Sir Alan Brooke, who was the chief of the Imperial General Staff. Either way, the demonstration was a success, even though it almost caused a diplomatic incident. Can you imagine the chaos if that bullet had hit someone important? But the point was made, pykrete was tough as hell. Now let's talk about the project itself. What would this ice aircraft carrier look like? Get ready because the numbers are absurd. Project Habakkuk, which was the ship's code name, would be 600 meters long. 600 meters. To give you an idea, the largest warship ever built, the USS Enterprise, is 342 meters. Habakkuk would be almost double. It would be 180 meters wide. The whole thickness would be 12 meters of solid pykrete. 12 meters. A torpedo exploding on this hull would do practically nothing. It would be like a scratch. The ship would weigh 2.2 million tons, 2 million tons of ice and sawdust floating in the ocean. And it wasn't just a stationary platform. Habakkuk would be self-propelled, with electric motors powered by steam generators. It would have a 600-meter takeoff runway, large enough for heavy bombers to take off. It would carry 150 aircraft. 150. And it would have heavy armament, 40 towers with dual anti-aircraft guns and dozens of smaller machine guns. The ship would be a floating fortress, practically indestructible. Can you visualize a monster like that in the middle of the Atlantic? German U-boats would see that and wouldn't know what to do. Tell me, if you were a German submarine commander and saw a giant ice aircraft carrier coming your way, what would your reaction be? But, as I said, nothing is perfect. The project had problems. Many problems. First, the refrigeration issue. To keep the ship frozen, they would need thousands of kilometers of steel tubing running throughout the hull, pumping frozen brine to maintain the temperature below minus 16 degrees. This would require 4 power plants just for refrigeration. 4 plants, just to keep the ship cold. Second, the ship would be slow, very slow. The estimated top speed was only 6 knots, about 11 kilometers per hour. A conventional ship could do 3 times that speed. Third, the cost. Initially estimated at 700,000 pounds, the price kept climbing as engineers realized the challenges. It reached 2.5 million pounds. And that was just for one ship. Fourth, time. Building this monster would take years. And the war couldn't wait. But the British didn't give up easily. They decided to build a prototype. And guess where? In Canada. Why? Because Canada had brutally cold winters and Canadian scientists already had experience working with ice. So they chose a remote location in the Canadian Rockies near Jasper, Alberta, a lake called Patricia Lake. And there, in total secrecy, they began building a scaled-down model of Habakkuk. But even being small, this prototype was huge. It was 18 meters long by 9 meters wide and weighed 1,000 tons. 1,000 tons of pykrete. Have you ever seen 1,000 tons of ice? And there's a curious detail. Who built this prototype? Conscientious objectors. That's right, people who refused to fight in the war for religious or philosophical reasons, but who agreed to do alternative work. These guys were sent to the middle of the Canadian nowhere to build a giant block of ice and sawdust, and were never told what they were really building. Imagine working for months on a secret project without knowing what it's for. Wouldn't you die of curiosity? During construction of the prototype, scientists faced all kinds of challenges. How do you shape pykrete? How do you install refrigeration systems? How do you test if that thing will really float and hold the weight? They worked through the Canadian winter with temperatures below zero, cutting and shaping giant blocks of ice mixed with sawdust. But the prototype worked. It floated. It stayed firm. The refrigeration system, powered by just a 1 horsepower motor, managed to keep the pykrete frozen. It was a proof of concept. Habakkuk was technically possible, but then the real problems started. As British and Canadian naval engineers studied the project more deeply, they realized the full version would require absurd resources: 300,000 tons of wood pulp. That was enough to affect the paper production of the entire country. 25,000 tons of insulating fiber, 35,000 tons of wood, 10,000 tons of steel just for structure and reinforcements. And that was just for one ship. If they wanted to make a fleet, it would be impossible. In addition, engineering problems emerged that nobody had foreseen. How do you steer a 600-meter ship? Initially, the plan was to control direction by varying the speed of the motors on each side, like how you drive a tank. But the British Royal Navy insisted the ship needed a rudder. And how do you make a rudder for an ice ship? A rudder that would have to be more than 30 meters tall? Nobody could solve this. And there's more. The more admirals thought about Habakkuk, the more demands they made. They wanted the ship to withstand the largest waves ever recorded. They wanted it to have a range of 7,000 miles. They wanted heavy bombers to be able to take off from it, which meant the runway had to be 600 meters. Each new requirement made the project more expensive and more complex. Have you ever worked on a project where the more you develop it, the more impossible it seems? Well, that's exactly what was happening with Habakkuk. But the final blow to the project came from an unexpected direction. In 1943, things began to change in the war. The Allies got permission from Portugal to use air bases in the Azores, which closed part of the gap in the Atlantic. Planes started receiving long-range fuel tanks, which increased their range. And the Americans were mass-producing escort carriers, small, cheap aircraft carriers that could accompany convoys. Suddenly, the black hole in the middle of the Atlantic was being closed. The U-boat threat was decreasing. And Habakkuk, which was supposed to be the magic solution, started to seem unnecessary. In December 1943, there was the last meeting of the Project Habakkuk Board. The official conclusion was that Habakkuk was impractical due to the enormous production resources required and the technical difficulties involved. The project was officially canceled. Winston Churchill, who had been so enthusiastic at the beginning, agreed with the decision. Mountbatten, who had been the project's biggest advocate, stepped away. Geoffrey Pike, the eccentric genius who had the original idea, was basically forgotten. Have you ever had a brilliant idea that just didn't work out due to circumstances beyond your control? Well, that's what happened to Pike. But wait, the story has an interesting epilogue. The prototype that was built at Patricia Lake stayed there, floating in the middle of the Canadian lake. And you know how long it took to completely melt? 3 summers. 3 summers of intense heat to melt 1,000 tons of pykrete. That shows how resistant that material was. Today, if you go to Patricia Lake in Jasper, you can still see the remains of the prototype at the bottom of the lake. Pieces of metal, parts of the refrigeration structure, all still there, like a monument to one of the most ambitious and crazy projects of World War II. So what can we learn from Project Habakkuk? First, that in times of desperation, people are capable of thinking of completely out-of-the-box solutions. An ice aircraft carrier? Who the hell would think of that? But Geoffrey Pike thought of it, and it wasn't a completely crazy idea. With the technology of the time and available resources, it was theoretically possible. Second, that sometimes context changes faster than your ability to execute an idea. Habakkuk would take years to build, but in a few months, the military situation changed. Third, that composite materials, like pykrete, can have surprising properties. Nowadays, we use composite materials in almost everything, from planes to race cars. Pykrete was one of the first examples of how combining different materials can create something much stronger than the sum of its parts. And fourth, that not every brilliant idea needs to be realized to have an impact. Project Habakkuk was never completed, but it inspired generations of engineers and scientists to think differently. Did you know pykrete is still studied today? Scientists continue researching its properties, especially regarding construction in extremely cold environments. Some people suggest pykrete could be used to build bases in Antarctica, or even on Mars, where water and fibrous materials could be combined to create resistant structures. But back to World War II, there's an aspect of the story we can't forget. Did the Germans find out about Project Habakkuk? Probably not in detail. The project was ultra-secret, classified at the highest level. But rumors leaked. Imagine German spies trying to understand the reports, ice aircraft carriers. They must have thought it was disinformation, an attempt to confuse German intelligence. But it was real. And if the Germans had taken it seriously, what would they have done? Would they have tried to develop something similar? Or would they have developed specific weapons to destroy an ice ship? These are questions we'll never know the answer to. What we do know is that Project Habakkuk represents a unique moment in the history of war, where human creativity was pushed to the extreme limit. It was a project so ambitious, so absurd, so brilliant, that even 70 years later we still talk about it with admiration. If Habakkuk had been built, would it have worked? Would it have changed the course of the war? Honestly, probably not. The technical challenges were too great, the cost was too high, and the time required was too long. But just the fact that they tried, just the fact that they took the idea seriously enough to build a prototype, That already says a lot about the human spirit. It says that when we're against the wall, when it seems there's no way out, we're capable of imagining the impossible. And sometimes the impossible almost becomes reality. So next time you hear someone say an idea is too crazy to work, remember Project Habakkuk. Remember that the British almost built an ice aircraft carrier. Almost, and they only didn't build it because the war changed before they could finish, not because the idea was impossible. Because if there's one thing the story of Habakkuk teaches us, it's that with creativity, determination, and enough resources, even an ice aircraft carrier is possible. The Germans mocked British engineering, thought the English were crazy, but when they saw that the British were building a prototype, when they realized that wasn't a joke, do you think they kept mocking? Or do you think they got scared? Scared that the British might actually make it work? Scared that a giant ice island would appear in the middle of the Atlantic carrying 150 planes ready to hunt their U-boats? I think they got scared, and with good reason, because Project Habakkuk showed that the British were willing to try anything to win the war, even building an ice ship. And that determination, in the end, was one of the things that helped the Allies win. Not because Habakkuk was built, but because that mindset of never giving up, of always looking for creative solutions, was applied to 1,000 other projects. Projects that worked. So what's the final lesson from Project Habakkuk? It's that sometimes the best ideas are the ones that seem craziest. It's that innovation comes from thinking differently. It's that today's failure can be tomorrow's inspiration. And it's that history is full of incredible projects that were never completed, but still deserve to be remembered. Because they show us what's possible when we dare to dream big. Very big, the size of an ice aircraft carrier,